Hi, everyone. I'm here in Washington, D.C. to talk with the CEO of PBS, Paula Kerger, about the latest threats from the Trump administration to cut off federal funding. Paula, great to see you. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
So I know that you have been the head of PBS for 19 years. So congratulations on that. How would you describe this particular period of your professional life?
It's interesting. Well, certainly this is a profoundly interesting time. It's probably an overused word for this moment because we find ourselves dealing with so many challenges, but also opportunities. I mean, the whole media landscape has changed tremendously. I think about when I started this job in 2006, and I remember giving one of my first speeches, and Apple had just announced that they were going to sell episodes of Desperate Housewives on iTunes. And it just felt so weird. It's like, who would do that? Who would buy TV on iTunes, you know? And it's just everything is, as we've been talking about, you know, has just really shifted in terms of how people consume content and what kind of content they're looking to consume. And for us, as even a public broadcaster, thinking about that is interesting. And then, of course, there's the political environment. And then there's the fact that I've been in this job for a long time. And when you have been in a job for a long time and you have seen many changes in the organization, you always get to those moments where, you know, you sort of reflect on, you know, what is next? You know, what are you thinking about as you look at the longer term history, future of PBS? What do you think about in your own personal life? So, yeah, it's a fascinating moment 19 years in.
PBS has such a rich, storied history. And can you talk about the role it's played in public discourse and for how long?
Yeah. You know, it's an organization that is meaningful to me because I remember as a child, at a time when we used to all sit in the living room and watch television together, and particularly Sunday nights with Masterpiece Theater and Alistair Cook and all of that.
And The Wonderful World of Disney, which was on ABC.
Which was on ABC, yeah. But we used to watch that too. Lassie came right before, I think, Wonderful World of Disney on Sunday nights, if I remember. But it was a different viewing experience. But television was so transformative. When I was really young, you know, the first role models of women I saw were on television, and they weren't necessarily the right role models. I mean, I think of watching I Love Lucy reruns, right, where you would I would sit really close to the TV set and watch, and, you know, she always aspired to do something different, right? And then there was Mary Tyler Moore.
Which was so formative for me.
It was so formative, I think, for all of us, because here was a professional woman. And so
And Julia, a black nurse.
And Julia, a
single mom.
Yeah.
I remember watching that as I was growing up, and it really broadened my horizon.
Yeah, it just made you think wider. And so when I think of public broadcasting, I think in my own experiences, the first ballet I ever saw was on public broadcasting. And so for things that I'm interested in now, I'm interested in natural history. So much of the, you know, series Nova and Nature and those things I watched on public broadcasting. And so if you sort of go back over the history of PBS, we've always been focused on just telling stories that, you know, hopefully are entertaining, but also, when we really hit our mark, are educational and uplifting. And I think we also play a really powerful role because we're actually local. And that's the one thing that a lot of people don't understand about PBS. They think of us like a network, but we're not. I mean, when I took this job, people said, oh, this is so interesting. You're going to be running 330 stations. And it's like, actually, it's the other way around. Stations are all locally owned, locally operated, locally governed. And we're the organization that was created by them so that they could create programs that we could all share. So an individual station, even in a big community like New York City, would probably not be able to create a NewsHour and a Sesame Street and a Frontline and a Great Performances and American Masters and all these great shows. But if you pull all the resources together, you can create something that is quite powerful. And so we're sort of like a co-op. And that, I think, also in when you look at the storied history of PBS, as you refer to it, it's really an organization that is built off of the contributions of many stations around the country, many of who create content. We have a great series that we did last year called Southern Storytellers. It came to us through Arkansas PBS. So it's a ground up kind of organization.
Can you explain sort of the role of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and
Yeah.
how it oversees the umbrella organization
Yeah.
that it is, and how it oversees both PBS and NPR?
Yeah. So actually, it funds us. So we actually are all three separate organizations. CPB was created as the organization. It's a private corporation where they receive the federal appropriation for public broadcasting that goes, as you point out, to public television, public radio. And their job is to distribute those funds to stations across the country. They make sure that each of those stations is operating in the public interest, and they, I think, do a great job of making sure that stations have the resources that they need to create programming. And so it's a separate organization. People are always confused. There's so many, CPB and PBS, and then there's my local station and how. So that's sort of the funding entity of the federal appropriation. And then PBS and NPR are totally separate organizations, and both of us created by the stations that we serve. So it is completely upside down.
But really, really important because, as you said, they hold the purse strings, and Trump's executive order directed the CPB to rescind funding from NPR and PBS.
Yeah.
First of all, is the president legally able to dictate how CPB allocates its funding?
No, and we are in the midst of figuring out how we're pushing back on that. The way that it was set up, and again, if you go all the way back to the founding of the Public Broadcasting Act, we're actually sitting under the pen, one of the pens that was used to sign that act, is that, when LBJ had this idea of creating public broadcasting in this country, he knew a lot about media. Family business was in radio, understood the power of it, also understood the importance that as much as the marketplace was going to be able to meet the needs of consumers, that there was a lot of content that would likely not be produced if it wasn't deemed to be commercially viable. And he looked at the BBC, he looked at other public broadcasters around the world. See, we're a little different in the United States. Commercial television came first, public broadcasting came second. But in many parts of the world, public broadcasting came first. It was viewed as a public good, and then the commercial marketplace developed. And he looked at the BBC and he thought, we should have something like that. So there were already some stations that had begun to crop up around the country, and he had this idea that if you created something that felt more like a network, and this is how we were then created, PBS, so that we could deliver services for everyone else. But he worried about the possibility of government influence. He worried that if we did our job well, that we would occasionally do things that might upset people. And so he thought a lot about protections to make sure that public broadcasting could continue to operate and not worry that someone would seek retribution if we did something that felt that upset people. So the corporation was set up as a private organization. Our stations receive the bulk of the money. So Congress appropriates roughly $500 million a year. Most of that goes directly to public radio, public television stations. And here's the other thing he thought about. He looked around the country and he realized cities like New York or Boston or Chicago or Houston or Dallas, big cities, they would be able to support a public media station. But stations in places like Corpus Christi or Peoria or Cookeville, Tennessee, Granite Falls, Minnesota, Bemidji, these are all small communities that without some level of federal support, there would not be a public broadcasting station. And he felt that access was going to be profoundly important. So he had this idea that he would create this public-private partnership. And so a little bit of federal money would go into stations, and in stations like my old station in New York, which is where I was before I took this job, it's a really small piece of the budget. But for strictly rural communities where there are public stations, it could be as much as 40 or 50%. In Alaska, for example, big parts of the state are only covered by public broadcasters because it doesn't make economic sense for commercial broadcasters to operate in areas where there are so few people. And so in the state of Alaska, I think 40% of their budget comes from the federal government. Without that, there would be no PBS in those communities. And so it was set up then as a private corporation. We also receive an advance funding 2 years out. So in this economic year, we have funding in place approved by Congress for 2027, 2028. And that also was sort of another effort to try to insulate. So if we did a program that upset someone, that someone wouldn't be able to come in and say, well, no more funding for you. So I think that those protections are in place, but that's what's actually being chipped away. So there's an effort to tell the corporation, you can't give any money to PBS or NPR. There's an effort to take away the advanced appropriation. There's an effort to remove some of the board members of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. All of these were things that were put in place to try to ensure that there was that editorial firewall between funding and the work that we do.
How powerful, though, is that firewall? I know you're
Well, we're
challenging
testing
a
it
lot
now.
of the things.
Now it's going to be tested. So the corporation is in court right now on the board members. And we are looking at the executive order and figuring out what legal action to take. And then on the rescission, as well as on next year's budget, that's the House and that's the Senate. And here is the opportunity for the public to weigh in. Because the one thing that I think we know is that people do care about PBS. Certainly right now we're getting lots of letters and emails and texts, how can we help? And many of those people are reaching out to members and saying, I like my local station, I like PBS. So we're hoping on that basis we may be able to turn the tide.
The FCC is also getting involved in how PBS operates and injecting itself into the system. Can you explain how and why and what that means?
Yeah, so we're a broadcaster, and so we operate within the guidelines of the FCC. And over the years, we have worked closely with the FCC as on a range of issues, including underwriting announcements for our corporate sponsors. Many years ago, we used to just show a blue card and with images that said "Thank you, Payne Weber." And actually, it was back during the Reagan administration that the FCC recognized that it should help us support some of our efforts to bring in additional funding from other places, because remember, we're a public-private partnership. And so over the years, we've worked closely with the FCC on those guidelines of what's appropriate for an organization like ours. And when the new FCC commissioner came in, he wrote to us and said, I believe that you have crossed the line and you're running commercial messages, and if that is the case, I will suggest to Congress that you be defunded. And
what did he mean by that? Commercial messages.
So a couple weeks later, we received a letter requesting all of the information about our corporate underwriters and the messages and so forth, and they're reviewing those against the guidelines. Now, I am fully confident that what we air on public broadcasting is in full compliance with the FCC. But that is unusual to have the chair of the FCC start an investigation like that. Normally when the FCC gets involved in investigations, it's because someone has filed a complaint. And usually the remedy of that is if you're found to have done something that is inappropriate, sometimes you're fined, but usually you're told don't do that again. And so this is highly unusual.
He seems to really have it out for you all.
Well, it's different than what we've experienced in the past.
What do you think is behind it?
I can't tell you. I don't know, except to I think
that you're not pro-Trump enough.
I don't know what has prompted it, and obviously we're taking it seriously. But it is. I think the reason that it's challenging is that at the same time, or actually I say ironic, at the same time, there is an argument that perhaps federal funding isn't appropriate, but you're also going to impact any ability that we have to deal with our corporate sponsors, which I worry that could have a chilling effect. So we'll see what the outcome will be.
Because in addition to viewers like you and me, you rely on these corporate sponsors.
I will say, the biggest percentage of money that comes into public broadcasting is viewers like you. So thank you.
The fight against PBS isn't just happening at the federal level. Indiana announced the state would also be cutting their funding to their local PBS and NPR stations. One station in Michiana, I hope I'm saying that right, said that they would be losing a third of their $4.3 million annual operating budget. So what are you all doing state by state? Because some places are going to lose, like 40% of their budget?
Yeah.
I mean, how are they going to survive?
Well, I think, there have been a few states. Not all states fund public broadcasting either. Part of that is, our structure is, again, because we're grassroots, so anyone could, for a time, people would apply for public broadcasting licenses. The very first license went to University of Houston. That's the very first station that went on the air. And a number of our stations, about a third of our stations, are affiliated with universities. Some states, particularly in rural parts of the country, also then became license holders. And the idea originally was to be like Classrooms of the Air. So if you were in a state like Nebraska, for example, you could put educational programs all across the state relatively efficiently. And so a lot of the states that hold licenses also give state funding to public broadcasting. In the case of Indiana, I think that was a budget issue. I think that at the very end of the day, literally at the 11th hour, I understand that in Indiana, they needed additional money to close the budget, and there were a series of programs that got cut. And the challenge in Indiana is, like states like Texas, that's on a 2-year cycle. So they're going to have to wait 2 years to actually go back and try to put that money back. And we are worried about stations like Michiana that I think are going to have challenges because their economics are so tight. But there have been debates in states like Oklahoma, North and South Dakota, where the debates were a little similar to the federal debates that are going on right now. And in all three of those cases, the effort to defund was overturned. And so, we are cautiously optimistic that some of our stations will make good cases, but I am worried about the fact that the potential cuts at the federal level combined with the state cuts really could put a number of stations out of business.
Talk about why rural communities are particularly at risk.
Yeah. So I remember, Katie, when I first took this job, I went to Nebraska and I was at an event some people from the station had organized, and there were some board members and there were some donors and some people from the community, and a man came up to me at the event and he said, "I drove 3 hours to this event. Are you the woman who's now running PBS?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I came here because I want to meet you and I want to look you in the eye and tell you this. When I made the decision that I wanted to raise my kids on the farm where I grew up, I worried a little bit because I wanted them to have all the advantages that a kid could have. And I worried that living in a rural part of the state, they would feel cut off." And he said, "But we have you." And he said, "And I want you to remember me because you are not a nice to have for my family, you're essential. And you can't mess this up." And so I've thought about him like really every day. And I have told his story multiple times because I think, look, I've been in this job 19 years, so I've been to not every one of our 330 stations, but most of them. And it's in rural parts of the country where I see that our stations have an outsized influence. A lot of these communities are also news deserts. You know, the local papers have folded. These are the places where candidates come in for debates. These are the places where communities come together for town halls. These are the places where the station works closely with daycare providers and teachers and others. They're a true community resource. I mentioned Granite Falls a few minutes ago. I went to the opening of their station there a few years ago, and the community was so pleased that they had this station, and they were doing so many community events and convenings and bringing people together. It had become a gathering place. And even in a rural part of the country, one of the people associated with the station said, you know, we used to stand out by our fence posts and catch up on what happened at the end of the day. And he said, we don't do that so much anymore. We need a place where we can come together, and that's what we envisioned when we created this station here. So I always believe that, first off, people misunderstand who uses public broadcasting. It's everyone in the country. Our demographics on our shows go completely across the wide diversity of this country. But I've always felt that in smaller communities and rural communities, our stations have an outside influence. I'll tell you another story. I was in Cookeville, Tennessee. Cookeville is in Appalachia. And again, this is a place where a lot of people still watch television over the air. You travel through the community, see a lot of TV antennas. The station has an extraordinary archive of video of stories that they have captured from Cookeville over the years. And this is a cultural heritage that no one else would have created besides a local PBS station. And so it's not just that it is an access point to information for people in the community, but it also is a place where the people that work in the station, live in the community, care about the community, and want to make sure that the history of that community is preserved.
Donald Trump is not, as you know, the first president, or first Republican, rather, to try to cut funding from public broadcasting. Every Republican administration, except for Gerald Ford, has tried to cut public media funding, and Donald Trump even threatened it during his first term. Before we talk about why this time is different, what do the Republicans have against PBS?
Well, it's funny because Republicans in general don't object to PBS. We actually have a lot of bipartisan support because many of our stations have members from both parties visiting them all the time. I just was in I was in a green room getting ready to tape something the other day, and a member of Congress was there, and I, introduced myself, and I said how much I loved his station, and he's one of the Ohio stations, and he said, yes, I'm really proud. I spend a lot of time at that station. So there's a really deep affinity. Somehow there's a disconnect. I don't know when it comes to PBS, but I know we've had really great champions. Barry Goldwater was a huge champion of Joan Cooney and Sesame Street. So I mean, it's interesting to me that administrations have, in some cases, tried to defund us, but I know that in the House and Senate we have a lot of champions.
The executive order also directs federal agencies to end any direct or indirect funding of NPR and PBS. So the Department of Education has since announced they're eliminating their grant to a show called Ready to Learn for Your Children's shows. Tell us about what that grant funded and the impact that revoking those funds will have.
Yeah. I mean, this has been especially hard. So for 30 years, we've had a relationship with the Department of Education. Every 5 years, this grant comes up for renewal. And what the department has done on every grant cycle is looked carefully at the needs of young children. So, we do programming for kids, but what we really focus on are preschool. And what we really focus on are the 50% of the children in this country who are preschool age are not enrolled in formal preschool. And the challenge is that if many of those children enter school the first time behind others who have had exposure to more resources, that gap many times is not closed.
I think it's by fourth grade. It's
and
sort
by
of,
fourth grade, if the reading skills are not at grade level, those children then fall further and further behind. So even going back to Joan Cooney, who created Sesame Street, and Fred Rogers, they had this idea that media could be a way to educate kids, not just be a safe place where you could leave a child while you were going to wash the dishes or whatever you're doing in the house, but that actually you could use the power of media to educate. And Fred knew really well how to integrate things like music, that you can reinforce lessons. So over the years, we have continued to refine the work that both Joan and Fred started to understand how to use media to make not only to understand those basic concepts that kids need to know before they enter school, but also how to use media in a way that really does, sort of spark creativity and imagination in kids' minds. So for 30 years, the Department of Education has provided early funding for new series that we want to produce. It has funded a lot of the research so that we not only, I can sit and say to you, I know for certain that kids who watch PBS Kids show marked improvement on letter recognition, on numbers, on some of the basic like social and emotional skills they need to do well in school. And so they've been a great partner. And then every 5 years when the grant cycle renews, then the focus may be on something a little different. We have assumed that this grant cycle was really going to focus on what has been referred to as the COVID gap, and all of the skills that kids were not developing, during that period. And we thought that it would focus a little bit more on particularly some basic literacy skills. But that grant program was terminated. And so what that means is it impacts our ability to develop any new kid series. It impacts the research. I mean, it's really quite devastating. And I just think that as we look at our country, as we look at how we come together and move forward, one of our biggest obligations is our kids and making sure that every child has opportunity. And so it just feels like, we know in the many years that we have been doing this work that we make a difference in kids' lives. So that has been just, we're just, it's been days since we found out. So we're just working now to try to figure out, are there ways to close the gap? Are there different things that we can do in the near term? But to me, this has always been a bipartisan issue.
Well, what is the rationale for doing that? What are you being told?
That we are no longer in line with the administration's goals and objectives. So I'm not sure what that means, but
don't they want to educate kids too?
Well, I just don't know what the issues are with us. I don't know.
Well, the president, and I'll tell you what some of the issues are according to them. The president and Republican Party say the impetus for all of this is bias in your coverage and creating, quote, left-wing propaganda. The White House released a document accompanying the executive order criticizing PBS and NPR's coverage of the pandemic and Hunter Biden, among other things, to say that this, the information that you all are disseminating on PBS and NPR is basically biased. And I'm curious to hear your response to that.
Yeah, when I looked at there is a press release that has sort of a fact sheet of the evidence of bias. And there isn't a lot there to really talk about. I mean, in terms of the COVID origins, we actually did fairly extensive coverage of, the various theories, including the Wuhan lab theory. So it's that I don't understand the criticism. And always when people say we see bias in your programs, and by the way, we get that on both sides. I get as many calls from people on the more progressive side as on the conservative side that have issues every night with every night's broadcast. I see this or I see that.
With
Sometimes
News
I wonder
Hour,
if they're
you're
even watching the same program. It's
Yeah.
like, but I do think that I always want specifics and examples. So give me an example. So you've given two. I just think that we're in a difficult time right now in our country around news coverage, where people forget that news is news, and it is not about hearing information that is reaffirming what you think you know. And I think that's part of the challenge that we're in right now, that people are gravitating towards news. And again, I see this on both sides of the political spectrum, where people want to have their opinions reaffirmed rather than their ideas challenged. And I think the consequence for this country is enormous, because we need to have the ability to come together around a common set of facts. To me, they're facts. They're not your facts or my facts. They're just they're
Kellyanne
facts.
Conway says alternate facts.
There are facts. So we somehow have gotten away from a common sense or a common understanding. And the second is the ability to actually sit down and have informed debate. That's the only way that we've been able to move things forward in this country, if you look back over our history, is that, we may look at things in different ways, but I think if you chip away at all of it, we at our core tend to agree more than disagree. But somehow we have devolved into a place where it's win-lose. I may have an opinion, you may have an opinion, and unless I convince you, there is no gain here. And always, I think we operate more as a country if we can understand each other and agree that we aren't always going to agree, but that at least we can come together around core ideas. And Ken Burns this fall is premiering a series on the American Revolution. It'll be a 12-hour, 6-part series. He began working on it about 10 years ago. And when we started talking about it, we were looking at the calendar and thinking, well, this will be great to do this right in advance of the 250th celebration, to look back on, the beginnings of our country and what those ideas and ideals were as we sorted out the beginnings of this nation. Not every country has such a clear origin story as we do, and it's one that is extraordinarily powerful as you think of the democracy movements that it sparked across the world. So it felt important at the time. It feels really important now. I feel that as we look forward and are trying to sort out very complex questions about who we are and where do we think we're going, part of it should be rooted on how we began. It was messy then. It is certainly messy now. And I think part of what I hope with doing a series like this, and this is the role I think that PBS and public media plays, is as a television event, whether you stream it or however you watch it, it is certainly an experience, but it will be successful if it sparks conversation. If people can use it as a jumping off point. Wow, I didn't know this about the beginnings of our history, or I didn't understand. I remember sitting next to Ken in a screening room watching it for the first time and sweating because I was sitting next to Ken in a screening room. He was paging through and the narration because he was at that point doing all of the fine cut work. And I was trying to think back to one of my favorite school teachers, which was Dr. Drum, who taught American history. And there was so much that I either did not remember or did not understand at the time. And I think for me, just recognizing the complexities of how this country did come together, I think will help as we think about where we're going, but only if we choose to put our, out of many one ideas behind where we think we're going.
Were you surprised that so early on in this second Trump administration, PBS and NPR were squarely in the crosshairs? Or given Project 2025, did you anticipate this?
I had read the Project 2025 report, I don't know, earlier this year, or earlier last year, I guess. And so I knew of it, and I had read the chapter on public media, so I knew that it was something that had been contemplated. I was really surprised that we would be so early on a priority. I think that some of the early what I thought would be some of the early discussions in the new administration would be around, we'd heard about cost cutting and so forth, and we don't quite fit there. I mean, we are an investment in the federal government. There's no question. I've always believed that if we feel that we deserve a federal appropriation, that we need to prove that we're worthy. I don't think anyone should assume. Government has to make hard decisions about how to allocate federal resources, and we need to demonstrate each and every year that this is an important investment for the country. So, I was prepared to be in those discussions, but this doesn't feel like it's about the finances. And in fact, you read it in the executive order. It talks about bias and describes us in ways that I've never heard us described before. I testified in front of Marjorie Taylor Green's DOGE committee, and the title of that committee is Un-American Airwaves, Holding the CEOs of PBS and NPR to Account. And I think that, you could certainly describe PBS and NPR, I'll speak for PBS since that's the organization I run, in many different ways, but never un-American. I always believed that we're the most American of institutions. We are very much a grassroots organization. We came from the ground up in the way that our stations were created. I've gone to places, Katie, where I've met people that put stations on the air that literally women did bake sales to put the station on the air because they'd heard of a show called Sesame Street, and they wanted to be able to have that for their community. And I meet people that are just so proud of the work that their local public television stations do. I mean, we are of the country that we attempt to serve. And to be called un-American is, to me, is something I never would have anticipated.
What's going to happen to many of these local stations, PBS stations, that really do rely heavily on federal funding, that are in news deserts, and who really are one of the only sources of news for many of these communities?
Well, I think some of the stations may be able to, make changes and adjustments, and will try to manage forward. They'll look different in their capabilities. I mean, we were talking a few minutes ago about the cuts to the Department of Education, from the Department of Education to Ready to Learn, that grant program. There was a big piece of that also funded activities at the community level and funded summer camps, funded workshops and programs that we do. We do a lot of work. We always refer to ourselves as, parents first partners. And so many of our stations have deep relationships and have for years with schools, with preschool providers, and with parents. And many of those have been canceled. We're in late May now, and so it's too late for those stations to scramble to try to find the funding to support some of this work. So so that's just a small example of what I'm seeing happening. I think there are stations that will go off the air. I think we'll figure out a way through digital to make sure that there's some PBS content, but there won't be anyone in the community creating local content. There won't be a place for people to come together. I think, and once broadcast licenses are gone, they're gone. It's a finite commodity. The stations would likely be sold, and that'll be the end. So this is why we fight really so vigilantly to make sure that this money stays and that people understand the consequence if the money goes away.
What did you think of that Marjorie Taylor Green hearing?
It was interesting, I guess is the best way to describe it. It is a difficult circumstance to go through a hearing like that, because everything is timed, right? So, you are looking at so just the optics of the room. It's a hearing room, so you're sitting in a well, and there's photographers in front of you, and then there's sort of a raked benches that are in front, so that rise up high. So just the optics of it is intimidating, and I believe powerfully in our democracy, so you also feel a little humbled that, here you are in a hearing room. And everything is limited to 5 minutes, so everyone has 5 minutes to ask their questions, and that also includes 5 minutes for them to make whatever statements they want, and you answer the questions you're asked and don't have much opportunity to elaborate on the story. So it was sobering in some ways, to be in that room trying to describe the work that we're doing in a way that hopefully will change minds. I did not have the sense going into that hearing that we were going to change anyone's minds. I think people knew what they wanted to ask, and they wanted to, use that hearing as a way to do that. So yeah, it was something I'll remember for a long time.
Obviously, PBS gets a lot of support from viewers like you and me. So the question is, can viewers or donations or corporate sponsors make up the difference between federal funding cuts for a lot of these stations? In other words, can you just do more aggressive fundraising? You're pretty aggressive as it is, but
yeah, I don't know that anyone is going to be encouraging more fundraising, but I do think that I think that some people will step up. I think that there will be more, hopefully more philanthropic money that will go in to support, public broadcasting in our stations and so forth. I think that, but I think as we also have seen with what is happening in journalism, with, there's that effort Press Forward, which is trying to really generate more local news organizations. It's been a difficult path to get enough money pulled together to make that happen. So I think there will be some. Obviously, we're thinking a lot about ways that we can help support our stations. We're thinking about ways that we can communicate the value, and so forth. So I do think that there will be efforts to try to put more resources together. But, I think either 2 or 3 times in the period that I've been in this job, the OMB has actually done research into whether there is a replacement for federal funding, and this is OMB research. This isn't, and every time they've done the research, they've come back with the same result, which is that the federal appropriation is important. It is critically important, particularly for some of those communities that, I really am just passionate about protecting.
can the state come up with some of the money that the federal government can't?
Maybe, but also remember what's happening in other areas. So public broadcasting isn't in a vacuum. There is a lot of pressure now, particularly at the state level, around cuts in scientific research. And many of our stations are at universities. Some of those are places that are trying to figure out how to close gaps where funding has been cut there. So I think there is a lot that feels like it could begin to unravel. And I think for organizations that are thinking about where to look beyond what has been, federal grants and so forth, I think there's going to be, I think it's going to be difficult to find out where some of that funding can be secured. Yeah.
Does the Trump administration have a bigger problem with the news division of PBS stations or with NewsHour, Frontline, things like that, versus sort of the other programming, children's programming? Although I did see an interesting skit with Joe Pesci playing, I think it was Ronald Trump or something, I can't even remember, but he was basically a developer and it was on Sesame Street. And I was thinking, I wonder if Donald Trump is still mad about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think all I can respond to is what I have seen in like the executive order, which talks about bias. And I think in that case, really what they're talking about, and if you look at the, again, the press release that came out of the White House alongside of the executive order, largely it's talking about news. It's talking about NewsHour. It's talking about series like Frontline. It's talking, in fact, the Frontline reference is to a project that we did 10 years ago. So, but I think that is what it's more focused on. It's not, I've not heard a lot about the arts programming or the
Children's
science and natural
programming.
history, or even much about the children's programming, although, the cut for Ready to Learn seems to indicate that there were issues there as well.
What does the future look like to you in terms of both PBS and NPR? Do you think that you'll be able to survive? Or what will the mosaic of PBS stations look like in a few years?
So, up until this moment with the federal funding, for me, this has been the most profoundly interesting time. So you asked me a little while ago about, what does it feel like being in this job for 19 years? And the thing that has kept me here, and believe me, I never thought I'd be in this job for 19 years. Most of my predecessors, maybe 5. I mean, this is a complicated organization to run because we are a federated organization. And in fact, I've always said if you want a lesson in humility, run a federated organization because you don't actually have a lot of ultimate authority, but you have a lot of responsibility. So, if things don't go well, it is, the buck stops here for sure. But our stations are all independent. They make their own decisions. They decide what to put on the air. And, for me, it has always been an extraordinary organization because there is so much creativity. There are so many, all of our stations are very different. And to see some of the work that they do is really inspiring. It is sometimes complicated to keep everyone sort of, it is cat herding, keeping everyone sort of focused in the same direction sometimes, but a lot of times it doesn't really matter. I mean, it feels like these are the voices of communities around this country, and this is very exciting. I think technology changes this in interesting ways. One is we're seeing things like what we're doing, podcasts, and it is fascinating to me, this opportunity that lots of people can be creators. And what does that look like? And to me, that's inspiring. A lot of our stations do workshops on how to do podcasts and do a lot of supporting, young filmmakers who want to work in different mediums. Some of it is on television, some of it is in digital and so forth. So I think that is exciting. I also think about the fact that we can create content that hits people in many different ways. In the early part of my career, you would labor over a broadcast show forever. It would have to be perfect when you broadcast it because you were sending it out to the world and you hoped that it would connect to people at a time when it broadcast. And so now we have archives that are available. So on digital, you can go to many different platforms, including Passport, which is a platform that our stations use as a thank you to donors, where you have access to, many years of library of great content. So that exists. You also have places like YouTube, where you can create different types of content. We have a Digital Studios, which is our YouTube incubator. And, we have series that have millions and millions and millions of subscribers, billions of views on platforms and with content that would never have fit exactly in a broadcast window. To me, that's really exciting.
Can you monetize that, though?
Some. So it's different. So we're trying not to be commercial in the way that we're monetizing. So when you look at the future, there may be some other ways to think about the business model. The other thing that's interesting is games, and particularly for kids, because we're in the education business, and even for young children can immediately figure out how to use screens and so forth. And to watch a show on PBS is great, but to actually interact with the characters, really just explodes the educational value of that. So for me, thinking about all of the different ways that we can create content that is, I think, in some ways more powerful and far-reaching than all of the great work we've done in the past, to me is really interesting. So if you look at the changes in the media landscape, and then you look at the possibility that our business model may shift a little bit, I think, if you look 5 years down the path, now I'm bullish on trying to hold on to the federal appropriations. So for a moment, I'm going to assume that that's the case. I think that we will continue to evolve in the way that we're trying to interact with the public in many different ways. And we also do a lot of work in schools, by the way, too. And so I think that being able to take better use of technology is important. AI is the other thing that we haven't touched on yet that I think has enormous possibilities if properly used, particularly for education, because you can create an interactive experience. Now, I'm not talking about is particularly generative AI that's built off of open internet. I'm talking about taking closed data sets of information and creating an opportunity so you can engage with a child. And we've been doing actually some research in this of how to create, again, even more powerful interactive experiences for kids to really increase opportunities for learning and engagement. So I'd love to see us play around more in those kind of spaces and do it for the public good.
Will your digital platforms face the same kind of political pressure as your television work? In other words, how might that reduce or increase the pressure on the content you're creating?
Well, it's different a little bit. So we're a broadcaster, so we very much follow the rules and the guidelines of the FCC. And but what we're able to do in digital, we actually want to look pretty much like we do on broadcast in terms of the kinds of content we do and so forth, but the form of it can shift a little bit, and the requirements are a little different in digital. So that's actually an interesting question of what
will
we
you
might do in
face the
digital.
same kind of regulations and political pressure online as you do in broadcast?
Well, I think what we would still have as a challenge is the funding side of it. So we're still going to have to figure out how to make all of this work with funding, because what I still would like to be able to do is still keep the infrastructure of our local stations and having some local media presence. They may look a little different. I mean, look, the cost of it could begin to shift a little bit as more and more people move away from broadcast. Broadcast is the most expensive piece of what drives everything we do. But here's the other thing that most people don't know. We take to heart the fact that we are a public service organization. And so we created programming for television, and then we figured out, some of this could be used in classrooms. And then we have thought about the fact that we have this broadcast infrastructure. We could actually be of service which we are. We're the backup infrastructure for emergency alerts for the country. This was an investment that the federal government made in an infrastructure of our public broadcasters. We cover the entire country. And if you've been in a place that has had a disaster, you know that cell phone calls become very difficult to make. Information becomes very difficult to push out. But broadcasters exist, and they can feed information to first responders and to others that is helpful, as well as really creating that redundant path for the rest of us. So I think there's a lot for us to think about and unpack as we look for the future. What does it mean to be a public service organization that has the resources that we do as a broadcast organization? And some of it may be in the ways that we've been talking most of this conversation about, which is delivering content that people are consuming, but also thinking about ways that we can also use our infrastructure to be of good.
What impact has this had on shows like Sesame Street, which are so essential for early education, like you said, especially for populations that aren't going to preschool or whatever in rural communities and other underserved populations?
Yeah. So Sesame Street is an interesting example. So Sesame Street is a separate nonprofit organization. And again, when I talk about public-private partnership, Sesame is a good example of that. And a number of years ago, they made an arrangement with HBO. And so HBO funded some of the investment in new Sesame Street episodes, but we distributed that content to the rest of the country. So you could watch it for free on PBS. And
But
we're in every
HBO
home.
isn't investing anymore.
And HBO is not investing anymore. So that is the challenge. They are looking for another partner that can work with us. So we're putting some resources in, and we are hopeful they will have another commercial partner, perhaps a streamer or someone else, so that we can again put all of these pieces together to enable something that is enjoyed by kids. No matter where they live or what their economic means. And, when I look at all the programs that we produce, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, this is an interesting story. Daniel Tiger is the descendant, literally, of Daniel Striped Tiger, who was a character on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Daniel Tiger is one of the most popular shows on PBS. It's been on the air for about 16 years. And it is for the youngest of our viewers. So it is teaching very basic skills to young children. Because it has been on the air for a while, we just did some longitudinal studies of 13, 14, 15, and 16-year-olds to see if there is any way that we could track whether watching Daniel Tiger as a child, we know what happens right after a child watches a show like that, but what happens looking forward. And the results, which were just published in Parents Magazine about a month ago, were shocking. That the number of kids that not only could remember the songs, that could remember the lessons, and some of it is also social emotional skills, like what do you do with the anger I feel, and how to manage emotions. They could sing those songs, and they remembered things like Ugga Mugga, which is what the dad and Daniel would do as a way of saying, I love you. I mean, what's more public television than helping kids have an experience that remembers, I love you?
If you had a chance to speak to Donald Trump about the importance of PBS and about the way that it is under threat right now, what would you say to him?
I would ask him to talk to people across the country, like the farmer that I met when I first started this job. And some will say, well, that was back in 2006. The world has changed. I will tell you, everywhere I go, people tell me the same story. This past year, we just started a new kid series called Carl the Collector. Carl is on the autism spectrum. And it is the first time that we've created a show that has a lead character who is autistic. And if I could show you the emails and the letters that we have gotten from families about the impact this one show has had on them, it would tell you why this is so profoundly important. This is the work that we do. We look at ways that we can help families. We look at ways that we can bring people together. We look at ways that we can help communities. And it is. I think if you would only talk to the people that use PBS, which is many people in this country, you would realize what an asset it is.
What would happen if PBS went away, in your view? And is there a threat that might actually occur?
Look, I think anything is possible. I mean, I think that we are hoping that we will hold on to the appropriation. If something happens, we are going to do our best to keep PBS whole, but we'll be a very different organization. An organization that does not bring together the entire country. And I think that would be a tragedy.
Do you feel that there are enough Americans, Paula, who really value PBS and what it offers people all across the country?
So here is the irony. We, like everyone else, do a fair amount of research. We try to understand who our audience is, who uses public broadcasting. I can tell you, our audience is 30, 30, 30. A third of the people that watch PBS are self-identified as being progressive, 30% independent, 30% conservative, and 10% aren't going to tell you, because they're never going to answer that question. But, we are deeply valued by everyone across the spectrum. And in these last months, we've actually done a fair amount of research around not just do you value PBS, but also your opinions about federal funding. And following the election, and we actually redid this survey, I think 3 times, we asked people who self-identified as having voted for the president how they feel about federal funding, and 60% said we support federal funding for PBS. So to me, that feels like there are people in this country who care about what we do, who believe there should be funding for PBS, and my hope is that those people will stand up. And that's what we're focused on, trying to make sure that people that do care let their legislators know how they feel.
Why do you think that number wasn't higher?
Higher than 60%? Because there are a lot of people that really do not believe there should be federal funding in much. They believe in small government. That's what I believe. But I do know that many people value our work and value what we do. So,
Paula Kerger, thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It was fun.